On the afternoon of August 4th, 1944, Major John Ward sat in a windowless basement room of the American military mission in Moscow, listening to a man beg for his life in a language he did not understand. The voice came through a radio receiver connected to British intelligence equipment, crackling with static and distance. A Polish translator, a young woman from the British liaison office named Catherine Morris, sat beside him with headphones, her pencil moving across a notepad as she converted desperate Polish into clinical English. He says the Germans are using flamethrowers in the Old Town district. He says they burned an entire apartment block with civilians inside because someone fired at them from a window. He says they have ammunition for maybe 3 more days. He says, please, where's the Red Army? We can see their positions across the river. Why are they not moving? Ward had been in Moscow 11 months. He was liaison officer for American observation of Soviet military operations, a position that sounded important and meant almost nothing. His job was to attend briefings, read reports the Soviets chose to share, transmit sanitized summaries to Washington, and avoid creating diplomatic incidents. He was 31 years old. He had studied law for 2 years at Ohio State before the draft caught him in 1942. The Army had determined that incomplete legal education plus reasonable intelligence equaled liaison duty. He coordinated information. He did not make decisions. 3 days earlier, on August 1st, Polish underground forces had initiated an armed uprising against German occupation in Warsaw. War had learned about it from a decoded cable that arrived the morning of August 2nd, marked urgent but not critical. The message was brief. 37,000 Polish fighters, weapons acquired through years of underground resistance, had attacked German garrison forces in coordinated strikes across the city. They expected the Red Army, positioned 20 kilometers away on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, to cross within 48 hours and complete the liberation. It was a calculated gamble. Hold long enough for the Soviets to arrive, establish facts on the ground, ensure that Warsaw was liberated by Poles, not simply occupied by the next foreign army. War had immediately understood what the cable did not say. The Poles fighting in Warsaw answered to the government in exile in London. The Soviet Union had established its own Polish Committee of National Liberation in Lublin 2 weeks earlier. 2 governments, 1 country. Whoever controlled Warsaw when the Germans were gone would have legitimacy that no diplomatic conference could erase. The voice on the radio continued. Morris translated without emotion. He says German reinforcements arrived yesterday. SS units. They are executing civilians in groups of 50. Public shootings in Wola district. He says the bodies are left in the streets as warning. He says they need supply drops, medical supplies, ammunition, anything. He says they are fighting with weapons taken from dead Germans because their own are expended. War asked the question he already knew the answer to. Can we respond to him? Morris shook her head. One-way communication. They broadcast on this frequency twice daily. We can only receive. How long have they been broadcasting? Since August 2nd. First message was confirmation of uprising and request for coordination with Soviet advance. Second message was request for supply drops. Yesterday they stopped requesting and started begging. The voice stopped. Static filled the room. Morris removed her headphones. That was Lieutenant Kowalski. He broadcasts from somewhere in Shodmishty district, central Warsaw. We think he is with the Kedi, the underground army director of sabotage and diversions. He has been giving tactical updates and casualty reports. Today was the first time he mentioned civilians being executed. Ward asked, "How accurate are his reports?" "We have no way to verify, but his information has been consistent with other sources. The Germans are systematically clearing districts. They are not treating this as military action against combatants. They are treating it as suppression of civilian population." Ward stood up. The room was small and the air was stale. He needed to brief Colonel Harrison, the senior American liaison officer, but he already knew what Harrison would say, because Harrison always said the same thing. Maintain coordination with Soviet command. Do not create independent channels with unauthorized forces. The uprising was not an American operation. It was happening in the Soviet operational zone. The United States had no authority and no obligation. But Ward had a question that would not leave him alone. If the Red Army was 20 kilometers away, if Soviet forces had overwhelming superiority, if Warsaw was strategically important, why had they stopped? He went to the map room. Soviet staff officers provided regular operational updates as part of Allied coordination protocols. The situation map for 1st Belarusian Front, updated as of August 2nd, showed multiple Soviet Corps level formations along the Vistula between Damblin and Modlin. The center of that line was directly opposite Warsaw. Forward reconnaissance elements had reached the eastern suburbs. German forces were designated as rear guard elements attempting to establish defensive line. Soviet forces had 3-1 superiority in infantry, 5-1 in armor, complete air dominance. By any reasonable assessment, the Vistula crossing should have happened already. Soviet operational doctrine emphasized exploitation of breakthrough, maintaining momentum, preventing enemy from establishing prepared defenses. The summer offensive had advanced over 600 kilometers in 8 weeks. Crossing the Vistula and pushing into Warsaw was tactically simpler than a dozen river crossings Soviet forces had already executed. Unless command did not want to cross. Ward walked to Harrison's office. The colonel was reading a report, his reading glasses reflecting the desk lamp. Ward had learned to read Harrison's mood by how he held documents. Relaxed grip meant routine information. Tight grip meant problems. Harrison was holding the report like it might escape. "Sir," Ward said, "I have update from British liaison on Warsaw situation." Harrison looked up. Without setting down the report, he said, "Sit down, Major." Ward sat. Harrison said, "I received communication from General Dean in Washington 1 hour ago. Private letter, not cable. He anticipates that we are receiving disturbing reports about events in Warsaw. He wants me to understand, and he wants you to understand, that Warsaw uprising is a Soviet operational matter. The Polish forces involved are not under Allied command structure. They did not coordinate their action with Soviet headquarters or with Allied command. The situation, however tragic it may become, is not within American authority to address. Our role is liaison with Soviet command, not independent policy. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Ward understood precisely. "I understand, sir." Harrison leaned back. "Now tell me what you have." Ward described the radio transmission. Morris translating Lieutenant Kowalski. Flamethrowers. Civilian executions. 3 days of ammunition. The question about the Red Army. Harrison listened without interruption. When Ward finished, Harrison removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Major, have you had meeting with Soviet General Staff about Warsaw operational timeline?" Yes, sir. Yesterday, General Antonov stated that First Belarusian Front is regrouping and consolidating supply lines. He said timeline for next phase of operations depends on multiple factors. He estimated several days at minimum. Several days, Harrison repeated. Did he provide specifics? No, sir. I assessed his response as deliberately vague. Harrison nodded slowly. That assessment is almost certainly correct. He replaced his glasses. Major, I am going to tell you something that is not in any cable or briefing document. Last week, before the uprising, I had conversation with Soviet colonel who I have worked with for 8 months. Good working relationship. Professional trust. We were discussing something unrelated, and Warsaw came up in passing. He said, very carefully, that Soviet command views Armia Krajowa as political problem, not military asset. He said that if London Poles establish control of Warsaw before Red Army arrives, it creates complications for post-war Polish administration. He did not say Soviet Union would allow Germans to destroy the uprising, but he did not have to say it. I understood. Ward felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sir, are you saying the Soviets are deliberately delaying to let the Germans crush the uprising? I am saying that Soviet operational timeline appears to align conveniently with Soviet political interests. I am saying that General Antonov's vague answer about several days is probably not vague by accident. I am also saying that Washington has made very clear that we are not to interfere with Soviet operational decisions in their zone of responsibility. Ward heard himself ask the question before he could stop. Sir, what if we shared intelligence directly with the Poles? Morris has the frequency they broadcast on. If we provided tactical information about German force movements, if we confirmed Soviet positions, if we helped them coordinate their defense, it might buy them time. Harrison's expression did not change. Major, if we established direct communication channel with Armia Krajowa without Soviet authorization, we would be conducting independent military operations in Soviet operational zone with forces not under Allied command. That would be violation of Allied protocols and direct contradiction of orders from Washington. It would also be completely ineffective because we have no ability to provide supplies or air support, which is what they actually need. We would risk significant diplomatic incident for symbolic gesture with no operational value. It would tell them someone knows they exist, Ward said. Harrison stared at him. Major, this conversation is over. You will not establish independent contact with Polish forces. You will not provide tactical information without authorization. You will continue liaison duties with Soviet command per existing protocols. If you receive further reports through British channels, you will document them and report to me. You will not act on them. Do you understand? Yes, sir. That evening, Ward returned to the basement room. Morris was there, monitoring the frequency. She looked up when he entered. They broadcast again at 2000 hours, she said. Different voice. Captain Nowak, I think. He reported German forces brought in 2 Tiger tanks. They are using them to demolish buildings where Polish fighters have established positions. He said resistance in Wola district has effectively ended. Survivors retreated to Śródmieście. Civilian casualties estimated 3,000 in last 2 days. Ward asked, Do you have equipment to transmit on their frequency? Morris studied him. We have transmission capability, yes. We do not have authorization to use it. If we did transmit, what would we say? Morris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We would tell them that Allied Command is aware of their situation. We would tell them that requests for support have been transmitted to appropriate authorities. We would tell them to hold on. That is not an answer. That is delay tactic." Morris looked at him directly. "Yes, it is exactly that. Because there is no answer. The only people who can help them are across the river, and those people have decided not to move." "What do you want me to tell them, Major? That the Red Army is sitting in positions 20 kilometers away, drinking tea while Germans burn Warsaw? That Stalin wants them dead because they are loyal to the wrong Polish government? That Allied command has decided their lives are less important than maintaining good relations with Soviet Union?" Ward had no response. Morris continued, "I have been listening to these transmissions for 3 days. I know their names now. Lieutenant Kowalski, Captain Nowak, someone they call Vistula, who gives intelligence reports. They think someone is coming. They think they just need to hold a little longer. They do not understand that they have been abandoned before the fight even started." Ward said quietly, "If I authorized transmission, would you do it?" Morris met his eyes. "You do not have authority to authorize anything, Major, and neither do I. We are here to listen and report. That is the role. That is the job." She was right. Ward knew she was right. But knowing did not make it easier. He went back to his quarters and wrote in his journal, the small leather notebook he kept locked in his footlocker against regulations. He wrote the date, August 4th, 1944. He wrote, "Today I learned that 37,000 people can fight and die for their freedom, and it will be called politically inconvenient. I learned that I am the person who will nod and say, 'I understand,' when really I mean I will obey. I learned that doing my job means filing reports about people burning to death, while I sit in a basement in Moscow and do nothing because nothing is the order." The next morning he attended coordination meeting at Soviet General Staff headquarters. General Antonov provided operational briefing on multiple fronts. When he reached First Belarusian Front, he stated that forces were regrouping and consolidating after successful summer offensive. He stated that next phase of operations would commence when preparations were complete. He did not mention Warsaw. No one asked. After the meeting, Ward approached Soviet liaison colonel he had worked with on logistics coordination, Colonel Petrov. They had developed functional working relationship over months of mundane coordination tasks. "Colonel," Ward said carefully, "I have question about Warsaw sector timeline." Petrov's expression remained neutral. "What is your question, Major? When does Soviet command anticipate resuming offensive operations toward Warsaw?" Petrov glanced around. They were in the corridor outside the briefing room. Other officers passed by. He said quietly in adequate English, "Major Ward, I will tell you what I can tell you. First Belarusian Front has orders to consolidate current positions. Timeline for next phase has not been communicated to coordination level. I suggest you direct operational questions to General Antonov's office through proper channels." It was a non-answer. Ward pressed, "Colonel, Polish forces in Warsaw are in significant difficulty. They are requesting information about Soviet operational timeline so they can coordinate their activities." Petrov's face hardened slightly. "Major, forces in Warsaw are not under Soviet command. They initiated action without coordination. Soviet command is not responsible for their operational planning or their consequences." Ward heard the message clearly. They are not our people. They are not our problem. He returned to the American mission and drafted a cable to Washington. He described the radio transmissions, the civilian casualties, the request for coordination, Antonov's vague timeline, Petrov's statement that Warsaw forces were not Soviet responsibility. He requested guidance on whether American command could facilitate communication between Soviet headquarters and Polish forces in Warsaw to enable tactical coordination. The response arrived 6 hours later. It stated that Warsaw situation was matter for Soviet operational command to address. United States position was to support Allied coordination through established channels. American liaison officers were not to engage in independent communication or coordination activities with forces not under Allied command structure. Continue liaison functions per existing protocols. Ward read it twice. Then he walked to the basement room. Morris was not there. The radio equipment sat silent on the metal table. He looked at the transmission controls. He had watched Morris operate them. Frequency dial, power switch, microphone. It would take 30 seconds to power up, switch to transmission mode, speak into the microphone. He could tell them someone heard them. He could confirm their transmissions were being received. He could say Allied command was aware of their situation. He could also be court-martialed for insubordination, violation of operational protocols, and unauthorized communication with foreign forces. He could end his career. He could create diplomatic incident that might damage Allied relations at a critical point in the war. He could do all of that for the satisfaction of telling men who were dying that someone knew they were dying. He stood there for 5 minutes. Then he turned off the light and left the room. That night, Lieutenant Kowalski broadcast again. Ward was not there to hear it. Morris wrote the summary. German forces had begun systematic demolitions of remaining structures in Wola district. Estimated civilian casualties now exceeded 5,000. Ammunition situation critical. Medical supplies exhausted. Request any form of Allied assistance. Request acknowledgement of the transmissions. Request confirmation that someone is listening. Ward filed the summary and did not respond. On August 10th, 6 days after Major John Ward stood in the basement transmission room and did nothing, Washington sent new guidance. The cable arrived at 0600 Moscow time, marked priority. Ward decoded it alone in the communications room. The message stated that President Roosevelt had personally raised the Warsaw situation with Premier Stalin through diplomatic channels. Stalin had assured the president that Soviet forces would resume offensive operations toward Warsaw as soon as military conditions permitted. In the interim, the United States was authorized to explore possibility of conducting humanitarian supply drops to besieged Polish forces, contingent upon receiving Soviet approval for use of Ukrainian airfields for refueling operations. Ward read the cable 3 times. The language created impression of presidential action and Allied coordination, but the mechanism of betrayal was embedded in the bureaucratic phrasing. Contingent upon receiving Soviet approval meant asking Stalin for permission to help the people Stalin was allowing to die. The request would go through channels. Channels would take time. Time was what the Poles did not have. Colonel Harrison called Ward to his office at 0730. Draft formal request to Soviet General Staff, Harrison said. Reference presidential communication. Request authorization for supply drops with refueling at Soviet airfields. Emphasize humanitarian nature and Allied coordination. I need it by 1000 hours. Ward returned to his office and began drafting. He wrote about humanitarian assistance and forces engaged against German occupation. He cited Allied cooperation and shared strategic objectives. As he wrote, he made a calculation. The request needed to sound urgent enough to justify presidential involvement, but not so urgent that it implied criticism of Soviet operational decisions. It needed to request help without suggesting that help was currently absent. It needed to be both plea and diplomatic courtesy. Ward made a choice. He removed a paragraph he had drafted stating that Polish forces had finite combat capability and that delayed assistance would result in their defeat. He removed it because it implied that Soviet delay was contributing to Polish casualties. He removed it because Harrison would edit it out anyway. He removed it because making the request processable was more important than making it honest. He submitted the draft at 0940. Harrison read it, made 2 minor edits, and signed it. "Deliver this to General Antonov's office personally," Harrison said. "Get written receipt and ask about timeline." Ward walked to Soviet General Staff headquarters through morning Moscow traffic. At Antonov's office, he presented the request to Major Volkov, the general's aide. Volkov read it slowly, his expression revealing nothing. "This concerns operations in Soviet zone," Volkov said in Russian. "Humanitarian supply coordination," Ward replied. "Also in Russian. Allied cooperation per Yalta protocols." Volkov nodded. "General Antonov will review. Response through appropriate channels. Can you provide estimated timeline for response?" Volkov looked at him directly. "Request involves multiple considerations. I cannot estimate timeline." Ward understood. Cannot estimate meant will not estimate. He requested written acknowledgement. Volkov provided single sentence on official paper confirming receipt. Ward filed it and waited. On August 14th, 4 days later, Morris found Ward in the map room. "You need to come to the basement," she said. "Something has changed." The radio was already powered on when Ward arrived. He heard the voice immediately, Major Krushel, the overall Warsaw commander, who rarely broadcast personally. Morris translated as he spoke. "He says German forces have consolidated control of western districts after systematic destruction of population. He says confirmed civilian dead exceed 15,000. He says his forces still hold Shodmishche, Zoliborz, and Mokotów, but ammunition is nearly exhausted. He says they have made decision to reorganize defensive positions to facilitate Allied supply drops when they resume. He says they are pulling back from forward positions in Mokotów to establish secure drop zones in Shodmishche Center. He says this will leave approximately 8,000 civilians in areas they are evacuating, but the reorganization is necessary to ensure supply recovery when Allied aircraft return." The transmission ended. Morris turned down the volume but left the receiver on. "They think more drops are coming," she said quietly. "They are restructuring their entire defense based on that assumption." Ward felt something cold move through his chest. "We have not received Soviet approval. We have not even received response to the request." "They do not know that," Morris said. "They had one supply drop. They think it was first of many. They think reorganizing to maximize supply recovery is reasonable tactical decision. They are choosing which civilians to abandon based on belief that we are coming back." Ward returned to his office and sent urgent cable to Washington. He reported that Polish forces were reorganizing defensive positions in anticipation of additional supply drops. He noted that this reorganization involved tactical withdrawals that would expose civilian populations. He requested immediate clarification of supply mission timeline so expectations could be managed. The response came back 6 hours later. Continue coordination with Soviet command regarding supply authorization. Do not establish direct communication with Polish forces. Maintain liaison protocols. The cable did not answer his question. It reasserted procedure. Ward understood that Washington had no timeline because Moscow had provided none. The Poles were reorganizing their defense for supply drops that existed only as unanswered requests in Soviet bureaucracy. On August 15th, Ward attended coordination meeting at Soviet General Staff headquarters. After the operational briefing, he approached General Antonov. "General," Ward said, "I delivered supply drop request from American command 5 days ago. Can you provide status?" Antonov gestured to empty chairs. "Sit, Major." Ward sat. Antonov remained standing. "Your request has been reviewed," Antonov said. "Coordination of Allied aircraft in Soviet operational zone requires extensive preparation. Air defense systems must be notified. Flight corridors must be established. Soviet air assets must be repositioned to avoid accidents. These procedures take time. We are working to determine if authorization is feasible." "General," Ward said carefully, "Polish forces in Warsaw are making tactical decisions based on expectation of supply deliveries. If timeline is uncertain, that information would help them adjust their planning." Antonov's expression did not change. "Major, forces in Warsaw are not under Soviet command. We did not authorize their action. We are not responsible for their tactical planning. If they make decisions based on assumptions about Allied support, those are their decisions. But if we provided timeline estimate, even approximate one, it would allow them to plan more effectively." Antonov looked at him for 3 seconds. "Major, I will be clear. Soviet command makes operational decisions based on Soviet strategic requirements. We coordinate with allies when coordination serves mutual interests. Situation in Warsaw involves forces loyal to London government that does not recognize Soviet interests in Poland. Our authorization of supply missions depends on many factors beyond timeline. I suggest you report to your command that review is ongoing and no authorization has been granted." Ward understood. Review is ongoing meant request is being ignored. No authorization has been granted meant no authorization would be granted. Antonov was telling him that the request would die in channels while Poles reorganized their defense for aircraft that would never come. That evening, Morris found Ward in his office, staring at a map of Warsaw with district boundaries marked in colored pencil. "They broadcast again," Morris said. "You should hear this." In the basement room, Ward listened to transmission from someone identified as Lieutenant Kowalski. Morris translated. "He says withdrawal from forward Mokotov positions is complete. He says they established 3 primary drop zones in Śródmieście Center, marked with white cloth panels, arranged in agreed Allied recognition pattern. He says security forces are positioned to secure supplies immediately upon drop. He says civilian population in evacuated sectors has been left under German control, approximately 9,000 people. He says this was necessary sacrifice to ensure supply chain when Allied support resumes." Ward asked, "What agreed Allied recognition pattern?" Morris looked at the notes from previous transmissions. Week ago, someone broadcast description of marking system they would use for drop zones. White panels in H formation. I do not think anyone on Allied side confirmed reception of that message. I think they are assuming we received it. Ward sat down. They reorganized their defense. They abandoned forward positions. They left 9,000 civilians. They did all of this because they think we are coming back. And we have not even received authorization to request flight plans. Morris said quietly, "Major, I have been translating these transmissions for 16 days. I know what is happening. They are dying because they think someone is listening. Should I tell them no one is listening? Should I violate protocol and transmit unauthorized message telling them to stop waiting? Or should I keep translating while they make decisions that get them killed based on assumptions that we are helping to maintain by not telling them the truth?" Ward had no answer. Both of them sat in silence while static filled the room. On August 18th, Washington sent new cable. Stalin had approved limited supply operation. Single mission. Tomorrow night. Soviet airfields available for refueling. Ward spent 14 hours coordinating operational details. 107 B-17 bombers. 1,284 supply containers. Flight path from Italy across Balkans to Warsaw, then east to Ukraine for refueling. Morris found him at 2300 hours in the operations room. "They are celebrating," she said. "They heard through underground channels that American bombers are coming. Crucial broadcast message thanking Allied command and confirming drop zones are secured and ready. He says the reorganization was worth the cost. He says supply line is established and resistance can continue." Ward looked at the mission parameters spread across his desk. Bombers would arrive at night. German anti-aircraft fire would force high-altitude drops. High altitude meant dispersion. Dispersion meant most containers would miss the drop zones. Maybe 20% would land in Polish-controlled territory. Maybe half of those would be recoverable before Germans secured the areas. The mission launched August 19th at 100 hours from Foggia. Ward remained in operations room through the night receiving updates. Aircraft reached Warsaw at 0530. German anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate. Bombers dropped from 4,000 meters, twice the planned altitude. At 0700, first aircraft reported landing at Poltava. At 0830, final aircraft confirmed on ground. 6 planes lost to enemy fire. Crews reported successful drops over target area. At 0900, Morris arrived with transcription of transmission from Warsaw. Ward read it, standing at the operations table. Major Trushiel confirmed observation of supply drop. Estimated 1,200 containers dropped. Approximately 200 fell within Polish-controlled areas. Approximately 120 were recovered before German forces advanced into drop zones. German forces appeared to have advanced knowledge of drop zone locations and positioned units to intercept supplies. Contents of recovered containers included ammunition, medical supplies, food. Supplies estimated to extend combat capability 72 to 96 hours. Request immediate authorization of follow-up missions at shorter intervals. Drop zones remain secured, but Polish forces cannot maintain defensive positions in evacuated sectors indefinitely without resupply. Ward read the assessment twice. Then he walked to Harrison's office without being summoned. "Sir," he said, "Germans intercepted the supply drop. They positioned forces at the drop zones. They knew where to wait." Harrison looked up from the report he was reading. How would Germans know drop zone locations? Ward felt his throat constrict. Polish forces marked the zones with the white panel formations. They broadcast descriptions of the marking system and locations on open radio frequencies because they assumed Allied command was listening and coordinating. Germans were listening too. The Poles advertised exactly where supplies would be dropped, and we never told them not to. Harrison's expression did not change. Major, we had no communication with Polish forces. We could not tell them anything. They made operational security decisions. Those decisions had consequences. Sir, they made those decisions because they thought we were coordinating with them. They thought describing drop zones was providing information to allies. They did not know Germans were the only ones actually listening for tactical details. Harrison said carefully, Major, this conversation is heading toward suggestion that American command should have established an authorized communication channel to provide operational guidance to forces not under our authority. That suggestion would be inappropriate. We followed protocol. We coordinated through Soviet command. What Polish forces broadcast on open frequencies was their responsibility. Ward understood he was being warned. He said, "Yes, sir," and returned to his office. That afternoon, Ward received intelligence summary from British liaison. German forces had launched major offensive into Mokotów district immediately after the supply drop, focusing on sectors Polish forces had evacuated to establish drop zones. Polish fighters attempted to return to forward positions, but found them occupied by German armor. Civilians left in evacuated sectors, estimated 9,000, were trapped between German advance and Polish retreat. Estimated casualties 1,200 in 6 hours. Ward did the mathematics. Polish forces evacuated positions to create drop zones. They broadcast drop zone locations thinking allies were listening. Germans listened instead. Germans positioned at drop zones to intercept supplies. Germans then attacked evacuated positions while Polish forces were out of position trying to recover supplies. Civilians died in the sectors Poles had left to facilitate supply drops that mostly failed. The reorganization intended to help had created the vulnerability that killed them. Ward sat at his desk, holding the intelligence summary. He thought about the request he had drafted 9 days earlier, the paragraph he had removed, the warning about finite combat capability and consequences of delay. He had removed it to make the request more processable. He had chosen procedural success over honest warning. The request had been processed, approved with 18-day delay, executed as single inadequate mission, and Polish forces had reorganized their defense based on belief that more was coming. His choice to make the request acceptable had contributed to decisions that got people killed. Morris found him at 2100 hours. "They are broadcasting," she said. Ward followed her to the basement. Lieutenant Kowalski's voice came through the speaker, quieter than previous transmissions. Morris translated. "He says German forces have taken Mokotów. He says civilians in evacuated sectors are confirmed dead or captured. He says the defensive reorganization to facilitate supply drops has failed. He says they are requesting immediate clarification from Allied command about follow-up supply missions because they cannot maintain current positions without resupply. He says if no missions are planned, they need to know now so they can reorganize again before Germans exploit current dispositions. He says, please, someone respond. He says we know you are listening because the aircraft came. He says we need you to tell us what happens next. The transmission ended. Static filled the room. Morris looked at Ward. Do you want me to transmit? She asked. I can tell them no more aircraft are coming. I can tell them to stop waiting. I can violate every protocol and probably end my career, but at least they would know. Ward thought about 18 days of channels and procedures and proper coordination. He thought about requests that went unanswered and authorizations that came too late. He thought about 107 aircraft and 120 containers recovered, and 9,000 civilians in evacuated sectors, and 1,200 dead in 6 hours. He said, if you transmit, Harrison will have you arrested. You will be court-martialed. Someone else will be assigned to this room, and the broadcasts will continue, and nothing will change except you will be in prison. Morris nodded slowly. So we do nothing. We do nothing, Ward confirmed. She asked, how do you live with that? Ward had no answer. On August 28th, 28 days after the uprising began, the transmissions from Warsaw stopped. The final broadcast came at 19:30 hours. Lieutenant Kowalski speaking, his voice barely audible above static. Morris translated the last message Ward would ever receive from Warsaw. He says German forces control all districts except isolated buildings in Śródmieście Center. He says ammunition is gone. He says they fought for 28 days believing Allied support would come. He says they reorganized their defense to help Allies help them, and that reorganization got thousands of people killed. He says they do not understand why aircraft came once and never returned. He says they are destroying radio equipment now to prevent capture. He says whoever was listening, he hopes the information was useful. He says history will record what happened here. He says he hopes history also records who watched it happen. The transmission cut to static. Morris turned off the receiver. Neither of them moved. Ward returned to his quarters. He did not write in his journal. He sat on his cot and calculated. One supply mission authorized after 18 days of channels. 120 containers recovered from 1,284 dropped. 72 hours of combat capability provided. Defensive reorganization to facilitate supply recovery resulted in evacuated positions. Exposed civilians, 1,200 dead in 6 hours. Total casualties in Warsaw now estimated at 65,000. He had drafted the request that led to the mission. He had removed the warning that might have changed decisions. He had chosen to make it processable rather than honest. He had done his job correctly, and people had died because of it. But that assessment was false comfort. People had not died because of his choices. People had died because of policy decisions made above his level. He had simply been the mechanism that transmitted those decisions downward, while appearing to provide help. He was not responsible. He was just complicit. And complicit was enough to make the rest of his life a question he would never answer. On October 2nd, 1944, Major John Ward received intelligence summary through British liaison channels stating that Polish forces in Warsaw had ceased organized resistance. Major Triciel had negotiated surrender terms with German command. Surviving fighters would be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention. Civilian population would be evacuated. The city would be demolished. German forces spent the next 3 months systematically destroying what remained. They used flamethrowers and explosives on buildings that had survived the fighting. They demolished the royal castle, the National Library. churches that had stood for 400 years. By January 1945, when Soviet forces finally crossed the Vistula and entered Warsaw, 85% of the city no longer existed. Population before the uprising had been 1 million. Population when Soviet forces arrived was approximately 1,000. Survivors hiding in cellars. Ward received these reports and filed them. His liaison duties continued. Coordination meetings with Soviet staff officers. Transmission of operational summaries to Washington. The war moved west. Soviet forces advanced into Poland, then Germany. American and British forces crossed the Rhine. In April 1945, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River. In May, Germany surrendered. War was present at coordination meeting in Berlin on May 10th, when Soviet and American officers celebrated victory with vodka and speeches about Allied friendship. A Soviet colonel, whose name Ward never learned, raised his glass and said through translator that the Great Alliance had defeated fascism and would build lasting peace. Everyone drank. Ward drank. No one mentioned Warsaw. In August, Japan surrendered. Ward received orders transferring him to occupation duty in Germany. In September, he left Moscow. He had been there 14 months. He never returned. The last transmission he had heard from Warsaw came on August 28, 1944. Lieutenant Kowalski saying they were destroying their radio and hoping someone had been listening. Ward never learned what happened to Kowalski. Soviet records, when they were eventually published decades later, did not list individual names of Armia Krajowa fighters. They were recorded as enemies of the people, bandits, fascist collaborators. Their names were not preserved. Catherine Morris, the British translator, was reassigned to London in October 1944. Ward never saw her again. He heard years later that she had left government service in 1946 and moved to Canada. He did not know if that was true. Ward remained in occupied Germany until 1946, then received honorable discharge with the rank of major. He returned to Ohio. He completed his law degree at Ohio State using GI Bill benefits. He graduated in 1948. He joined a firm in Toledo, practicing corporate law. He married in 1949. Her name was Elizabeth. She was a teacher. They had 3 children over the next 6 years. Ward did not talk about the war. When people asked, he said he had been liaison officer in Moscow, mostly paperwork and coordination meetings. He did not mention Warsaw. He did not mention the basement room, or the transmissions, or the supply drop that came too late. Elizabeth asked him once, in 1952, if something had happened during the war that bothered him. He said no. She did not ask again. In 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea and the United States entered another war, Ward followed the news carefully. He read about American military advisors coordinating with South Korean forces. He read about supply lines and tactical coordination and Allied cooperation. He wondered if there were officers in Korea standing in communications rooms, listening to people die while filing reports about proper channels. He did not share these thoughts with anyone. In 1956, Soviet forces suppressed uprising in Hungary. Ward read newspaper accounts of Hungarian fighters requesting Western support while Soviet tanks surrounded Budapest. He read that the United States had not intervened because Hungary was in Soviet sphere of influence. An intervention would risk broader conflict. The language was familiar. He read that approximately 2,500 Hungarians had died. He filed the newspaper and did not discuss it. Poland remained under Soviet control. The government in Lublin that Stalin had established became the official government of post-war Poland. The government in exile in London was not recognized. Leaders of Armia Krajova, who survived the war, were arrested by Soviet security services. 16 of them were brought to Moscow in 1945 for show trial. They were charged with collaboration with Germans and crimes against Soviet Union. All were convicted. Some received prison sentences. 2 died in custody under circumstances that were never fully explained. Ward learned these details from newspaper reports over the years. He never wrote letters to editors or contacted veterans organizations or spoke publicly about what he knew. He built his career. He attended his children's school events. He became partner in his firm in 1958. He bought a house in Toledo suburbs with lawn and garage. He attended church on Sundays. He lived a normal life. In 1968, Soviet forces suppressed Prague Springs in Czechoslovakia. Ward was 55 years old. He watched television coverage of Soviet tanks in Prague streets, while Czech civilians threw rocks and painted over street signs to confuse invading troops. He watched American officials explain that Czechoslovakia was in Soviet sphere and direct intervention was not possible. He turned off the television and went to his office and closed the door. Elizabeth found him there an hour later, sitting in the dark. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He was not fine. In 1973, Ward attended reunion of officers who had served in Moscow liaison mission during the war. It was held in Washington. Approximately 30 men attended. Colonel Harrison was there, retired now, living in Virginia. They shook hands. They talked about weather and grandchildren. No one mentioned Warsaw. At dinner, someone proposed toast to Allied cooperation and victory over fascism. Everyone drank. Ward drank. Afterward, Harrison found Ward in the hotel lobby. They had not spoken privately in 29 years. Harrison said, "Major Ward," still Major Ward in my head. "You did good work in Moscow. Professional conduct throughout." Ward said, "Thank you, sir." Harrison looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I read the histories. I know what they say about Warsaw. I know what we knew, and when we knew it. I want you to know that I think about it. I want you to know it was not our decision. We followed orders from the highest levels. We did our duty." Ward said, "Yes, sir." Harrison said, "We could not have changed anything. You understand that, right? If we had violated protocols, if we had established unauthorized communication, if we had pushed harder on the Soviets, it would not have changed the outcome. Stalin made the decision. We were just liaison officers." Ward said, "Yes, sir, I understand." He understood that Harrison needed to believe they could not have changed anything. He understood that Harrison had built 30 years of life on that belief. He understood that Harrison was asking Ward to confirm the belief so they could both continue building. Ward did not provide the confirmation. He said goodnight and went to his room. In 1980, British historian Nikolai Tolstoy published a book titled The Minister and the Massacres, about forced repatriation of Soviet citizens after the war. The book included details about Allied knowledge of Soviet intentions and decisions to proceed with repatriations despite that knowledge. Ward bought the book. He read it in his study over 3 nights. The book did not mention Warsaw specifically, but the patterns were identical. Political calculations, proper channels, decisions made at highest levels, officers following orders. Ward wrote letter to Tolstoy. He identified himself as former liaison officer in Moscow during 1944. He described the transmissions from Warsaw and the request for supply authorization and the 18-day delay and the single inadequate mission. He described the defensive reorganization that exposed civilians and the German interception of supplies and the final transmission on August 28th. He wrote, "I do not know if anything I did or did not do changed the outcome. I only know that I participated in a system that allowed 65,000 people to die for political convenience while we filed reports and followed procedures." Tolstoy replied 6 weeks later. His letter thanked Ward for the information. It noted that Ward's account confirmed details that Tolstoy had found in recently declassified British archives. It said that similar patterns of delay and inadequate response appeared throughout the Warsaw period in both American and British documents. It said that responsibility for Warsaw deaths rested primarily with Stalin and Soviet command, but that Western Allied governments had chosen not to challenge Soviet actions because maintaining the alliance was deemed more important than Polish lives. It concluded, "You ask if you could have changed the outcome. The honest answer is that individual officers at liaison level could not have altered decisions made by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, but individuals at every level chose to implement those decisions without protest, and collective implementation is what made the policy possible. I cannot absolve you. I can only note that you were not alone." Ward filed the letter. He did not share it with Elizabeth or his children. He did not pursue further correspondence. He continued his life. In 1988, Ward was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had never smoked. His doctor said sometimes it happened without clear cause. Treatment options at his age and stage were limited. He had perhaps 6 months. He gathered his children in April. They were adults now, living in different cities with their own families. He told them about the diagnosis. Then he told them about Warsaw. He described the transmissions and the requests and the delays and the supply drop and the final message from Lieutenant Kowalski. He told them he had been part of a system that let people die because helping them was politically inconvenient. He told them he had filed reports and followed orders and done nothing that violated any regulation or protocol. He told them that everything he had done was correct, and that correctness had contributed to deaths of 65,000 people. His daughter asked why he had never spoken about this before. Ward said, "Because I thought if I did not talk about it, eventually I would stop thinking about it." That did not happen. His son asked if there was anything Ward could have done differently. Ward said, "I could have refused orders. I could have established unauthorized communication with Polish forces and warned them that no help was coming. I could have sent unauthorized cables to Washington describing exactly what was happening and demanding action. I could have resigned my commission in protest. Any of those actions would have ended my career and possibly resulted in court-martial. They probably would not have saved anyone in Warsaw. But I would have tried. I chose not to try because I was afraid of consequences to myself. That is the answer." His other daughter asked if he wanted forgiveness. Ward said, "No, I do not think I should be forgiven. I think I should be remembered as someone who had opportunity to do the right thing at cost to himself, and chose not to. I think that is more useful than forgiveness." John Ward died on June 3rd, 1988, at the age of 75. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Toledo with military honors. Approximately 80 people attended the funeral. The service included reading from Gospel of Matthew and performance of taps by honor guard from local veterans post. No one mentioned Warsaw. After his death, Elizabeth found small cardboard box in his study locked in bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were copies of cables and intelligence summaries from August 1944, maps of Warsaw with districts marked in colored pencil, transcriptions of radio transmissions in Catherine Morris's handwriting, photograph of Major John Ward standing outside Soviet General Staff headquarters in Moscow, dated September 1944. On the back of the photograph, in Ward's handwriting, "I was here when it happened. I knew what was happening. I did what I was told and called it duty." Elizabeth did not know what to do with the materials. She contacted the National Archives to ask if they would be interested in the documents for historical record. The archives accepted them. They were filed in Record Group 218, Records of United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. They remain there. Researchers can request access. In 1990, 2 years after Ward's death, Poland held its first free elections since before World War II. The communist government fell. Archives began opening. Historians began documenting what had happened during the Warsaw Uprising with access to previously suppressed records. In 2004, 60 years after the uprising, the city of Warsaw erected a memorial to the fighters and civilians who died. The memorial includes a wall with names of identified victims. Approximately 11,000 names are listed. The remaining 54,000 who died were never identified. Their names were lost. Lieutenant Kowalski is not on the wall. Soviet records listed him as enemy of the people, fate unknown. There is no grave. There is no marker. He exists in Catherine Morris's transcription notes in National Archives and nowhere else. Major Truchel survived the war. He was held as prisoner by Germans until 1945. After liberation, he went to London rather than return to Soviet-controlled Poland. He lived in exile for 40 years. He wrote memoir about the uprising that was published in 1970. He died in London in 1988, 3 months after John Ward died in Toledo. He never returned to Poland. His body was brought back for burial in 1994 after communism ended. He was buried in military cemetery in Warsaw with honors. In the memoir, Truchel wrote, "We believed the Allies would help us because we did not understand that we had become inconvenient. We thought fighting for our freedom gave us value. We learned that value is determined by politics, not by courage or sacrifice." This is the lesson of Warsaw. I do not know if it was a lesson worth 65,000 lives. The question remains unanswered.